Welcome to our deep dive into the sometimes confusing world of ESG ratings
Yeah.
and the EU's kind of ambitious move to try to regulate them.
Yeah.
It's no secret that ESG investing is exploding right now,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
with so many different rating providers out there, it's become
Yeah.
like a real challenge to know
Right.
who to trust.
Exactly.
That's where this new EU regulation comes in.
Yeah.
Regulation EU 2024-3005.
Mm.
We're going to break down the dense legal jargon
Wow.
and give you the insights you need to understand what this is all about and how it impacts you as an investor.
I think the EU is really on a mission here
Yep.
to make sustainable finance a core part of their economic strategy.
Right.
And this regulation is a major piece of that puzzle.
Yeah.
By creating a clear framework for ESG ratings,
Right.
the EU aims to bring order to what's been, frankly, a bit of a Wild West situation.
So instead of this free-for-all,
Yeah.
when everyone's using different methods and
Yeah.
even different definitions of what ESG even means,
Mm.
the EU wants to level the playing field.
Exactly.
For the average investor, trying to compare ESG ratings from different providers
Mhm.
has been like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah, it's been incredibly difficult
Right.
to figure out which companies are truly walking the walk when it comes to sustainability. And this lack of standardization has also opened the door for potential greenwashing,
Right.
which is a major concern for investors who want to make sure their money is actually supporting sustainable practices.
Now here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
This regulation doesn't just focus on the EU.
Mm-hmm.
It specifically references the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
It's like the EU is saying, hey, we're not just doing this for ourselves, we're aligning with these global sustainability efforts.
It's a strong signal
Okay.
that the EU sees this as part of a bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just trying to create a regional framework.
Mm.
They're aiming to influence the global conversation around sustainable finance.
So let's get into the nuts and bolts of this regulation. First, how does the EU actually define an ESG rating?
Well, Article 3 of the regulation provides that definition. It's surprisingly straightforward.
Yep.
An ESG rating can be an opinion, a score,
Okay.
or a combination of both,
Mm-hmm.
but it has to be based on a clear methodology and a transparent ranking system.
Okay, so this is a crucial step towards standardization. Instead of just having random pronouncements about a company's ESG performance, the EU is demanding like a systematic and transparent approach.
Yeah.
Think of it like a set of rules that ensures all ESG ratings are playing the same game using the same playbook.
Exactly. And to make sure everyone's on the same page, the regulation even goes further.
Okay.
It draws a distinction between an ESG opinion, which involves an analyst directly evaluating a company,
Okay.
and an ESG score, which is typically derived from an algorithm or a model.
So the distinction really helps us understand the
Yeah.
different approaches and potential biases that might exist in each method.
Exactly.
For you, the listener, this means you can start to critically evaluate ESG ratings and understand the process behind them.
It's about empowering investors with the knowledge to make more informed decisions
Yeah.
and to ensure a clear scope.
Okay.
The regulation also clarifies what activities are not considered ESG ratings.
Okay.
This includes things like private ratings created for individual clients,
Okay.
internal ratings used by financial institutions,
Mhm.
and simply providing ESG data without turning it into a formal rating.
It seems like the EU wants to make sure that everyone understands the boundaries of this regulation.
Yeah,
It's all about clarity and transparency.
right. And there's another interesting point here. The regulation acknowledges that there are different business models
Right.
for ESG ratings. Some providers are paid by the investors who use their ratings.
Okay.
That's user paid,
Mhm.
while others are paid by the companies themselves,
Right.
issuer paid.
That's interesting. Talk about potential conflicts of interest.
It's certainly a challenge,
Yeah.
but it's good that the regulation recognizes these different models.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that they're trying to create a framework that accommodates the various ways ESG ratings are produced and consumed.
So with all this in mind, what is the EU really trying to achieve with this regulation? What's the ultimate goal?
Article 1 gets straight to the point.
Okay.
The regulation aims to enhance the integrity, transparency, comparability, where possible,
Mhm.
responsibility, reliability, good governance, and independence of the ESG rating market.
So it sounds like the EU wants to build a system that's trustworthy, accountable,
Right.
and truly serves the interests of investors.
Yeah.
No more smoke and mirrors, no
Yeah.
more hidden agendas.
That's the idea. By creating a level playing field and promoting transparency, the EU hopes to ensure that ESG ratings are actually driving positive change and not just being used for greenwashing.
So for you as a listener, this means you can start to have more confidence
Right.
in ESG ratings as a tool for making informed investment decisions. And it means that companies will be held to a higher standard when it comes to their sustainability performance.
Exactly. It's all about creating a more sustainable financial system that benefits both investors and the planet.
Right.
And that brings us back to those UN Sustainable Development Goals we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that this regulation is part of a much larger effort to create a more sustainable future for everyone.
Okay, so we've established the why and the what of this regulation. Now let's get down to the who. Who exactly needs to comply with these new rules?
Article 2 is all about defining the scope of the regulation.
Okay.
It essentially boils down to whether an ESG rating provider is operating in the union.
Okay.
If you're an ESG rating provider established in the EU and issuing ratings within the EU,
Right.
you're in.
Okay.
And even if you're outside the EU but you're distributing ratings within the EU, you're still subject to these rules.
So the EU is casting a wide net here. They want to make sure that any ESG rating provider operating within their borders is playing by the rules.
Exactly.
And that includes protecting European investors from potentially misleading ratings from non-compliant providers outside the EU, right?
Absolutely. There are very limited situations where an investor in the EU can engage with a non-compliant provider.
Right.
But the conditions are extremely stringent. The EU is serious about closing any loopholes.
It's like they're saying, we're building a high-quality ESG rating system here, and we're not going to let anyone undermine it.
Yeah.
Now let's dive into the key aspects of the regulation. How does it actually work in practice?
Well, it all starts with an authorization process.
Okay.
Any ESG rating provider operating in the EU needs to be authorized by the relevant authorities.
Okay.
This involves a thorough assessment of their methodologies, their data sources, their governance structures, and more.
It sounds like a pretty rigorous process.
It is. The EU wants to make sure that only reputable and trustworthy providers are given the green light to operate in their market.
But they've also recognized that smaller providers might need some extra support
Right.
to get up to speed.
So it wouldn't be fair to create a system that only benefits large, established players.
Right.
What about smaller providers? Do they have to go through the same authorization process?
For smaller ESG rating providers, as defined by EU criteria, there's a temporary registration process.
Okay.
It's kind of like a stepping stone, giving them time to meet the full authorization requirements.
So the EU is trying to strike a balance between ensuring high standards and supporting innovation in the ESG rating market. And speaking of high standards, let's talk about transparency. This seems to be a major focus of the regulation.
Transparency is absolutely crucial. Article 23 and Annex 3 are all about disclosure requirements.
Okay.
ESG rating providers have to be completely open about their methodologies, their data sources, their ownership structures, how they weigh different factors, the list goes on. It's like the EU is saying, show us your work. We want to see exactly how you're arriving at your ratings.
Right.
This level of transparency is really important for you, the listener, because it allows you to peek behind the curtain and understand what's driving the ratings you see.
Exactly. It allows you to assess the credibility and reliability of the ratings, to compare different providers, and to ultimately make more informed decisions. And here's a detail worth noting. The EU actually prefers separate ratings for environmental, social, and governance factors. They're not big fans of a single aggregated ESG score.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
A single score can mask a lot of important information. It's like giving a student one grade for all their subjects combined. You don't get a sense of their strengths and weaknesses.
Right. While aggregated scores are allowed,
Okay.
the regulation requires providers to be very clear about how they calculate them, disclosing the weighting of each category. This ensures that investors have a more nuanced understanding of a company's ESG performance.
So even if you see a single ESG score, you know that you need to dig deeper and look at the individual E, S, and G ratings to get the full picture.
And it's worth noting that even with this push for transparency, the EU recognizes that ESG rating providers need to protect their intellectual property.
Right.
The regulation includes safeguards to prevent them from having to disclose genuine trade secrets.
It's a delicate balance
Yeah.
between transparency and protecting innovation. Now, let's move on to another critical aspect of the regulation: conflicts of interest. This is always a hot topic when it comes to ratings of any kind.
Yeah. The EU is taking a strong stance on this.
Okay.
Articles 16 and 25 are all about preventing and managing conflicts of interest. There are strict rules in place to ensure that ESG ratings are truly independent and impartial.
So, for example, an ESG rating provider can't also be offering consulting services to the companies they're rating. That would be a clear conflict of interest.
Right. And they can't offer credit ratings or auditing services from the same entity that's providing ESG ratings. The goal is to prevent any situations where a provider might be tempted to give a company a favorable ESG rating in order to win their business in other areas.
And there are even rules about employee conduct and compensation.
Right.
The regulation prohibits bonuses or other incentives tied to giving certain companies favorable ratings.
It's all about removing any potential bias from the process.
Yeah.
ESMA,
Okay.
the European Securities and Markets Authority, also has a key role to play here. They're responsible for ensuring that ESG rating providers have robust governance structures in place to prevent and manage conflicts of interest.
So ESMA is like the watchdog,
Yeah.
making sure everyone is playing fair. But what exactly can ESMA do if they find a provider isn't complying with the regulation?
Well, ESMA has some pretty significant powers.
Okay.
They can request information, they can conduct on-site inspections, they can issue public notices, and even impose fines or penalties for non-compliance.
Wow, it sounds like the EU is really serious about enforcing these rules.
They are. But it's important to note that ESMA or any other authority can't interfere with the content of the ratings or methodologies. Their role is to ensure compliance with the process, not to dictate the outcome.
That's a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
It means that ESG rating providers still have the freedom to develop their own approaches and methodologies as long as they meet the transparency and governance standards set out in the regulation.
Exactly. It's a balance between regulation and innovation.
Mm-hmm.
The EU wants to create a framework that fosters a high-quality, trustworthy ESG rating market without stifling creativity and progress in the field.
And before we move on to the next section, I want to highlight an important point. While we've been focusing on the financial sector, the EU acknowledges that ESG ratings are being used beyond just investment decisions.
That's right. We're seeing ESG ratings increasingly being used in areas like procurement and supply chains.
So a company's ESG rating might influence whether they're selected as a supplier or not. It's a sign that sustainability is becoming a core factor in business decisions across the board.
It is, and that means the implications of this regulation extend far beyond just the world of investing.
It's a reminder that sustainability is no longer just a niche concern.
Right.
It's becoming a core element of how businesses operate and how we make decisions.
And with this growing influence of ESG ratings, the EU is wisely looking ahead. Remember how we mentioned the review mandated for 2029?
Yeah.
That's going to be crucial in assessing whether the scope of this regulation needs to widen, potentially to include those ESG data providers we discussed.
Right, because right now the regulation focuses on those who create ESG ratings, but not necessarily on the underlying data itself.
Right.
As the saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. If the data feeding into these ratings is unreliable or inconsistent, the ratings themselves will be flawed.
Precisely. The EU is aware of that risk, and they're already signaling that they might need to bring ESG data providers under the regulatory umbrella in the future.
Makes you wonder what a future with regulated ESG data might look like.
Yeah.
Would companies be required to report their ESG data in a standardized format? Would there be independent verification of that data? It raises a lot of interesting questions.
It certainly does. It'll be fascinating to see how this regulatory landscape evolves as the ESG ecosystem matures.
So let's shift our focus for a moment and think about the practical implications of all this. If you're an investor listening to this, what are some key takeaways you should be thinking about?
Well, first and foremost, pay attention to whether the ESG rating providers you're relying on are authorized or registered under these new EU regulations. It's a basic but important step to ensure they've met the standards for transparency, independence, and rigor.
Think of it like a quality check.
Right.
You wouldn't buy a product without checking for safety certification.
Exactly.
The same principle applies here.
And don't just stop at the overall ESG score.
Right.
Remember our discussion about aggregated scores, potentially hiding important details. Dig deeper. Look at the individual environmental, social, and governance ratings.
To get a more comprehensive understanding of a company's performance.
It's about seeing the whole picture, not just a snapshot.
Exactly.
You want to know if a company is truly committed to sustainability across all three pillars,
Yeah,
not just excelling in one area while lagging behind in others.
absolutely. And don't hesitate to ask questions.
Okay.
Reach out to the ESG rating providers
hmm
and inquire about their methodologies, their data sources,
hmm
and their conflict of interest policies.
It's your money, after all,
Well,
and you have the right to understand how these ratings are being generated.
exactly. This regulation is designed to empower investors.
Okay.
By arming yourself with knowledge, you can navigate this complex world of ESG investing with more confidence.
Now let's take a step back and consider the broader implications of this regulation. What does it signal about the EU's commitment to sustainability?
Uh, I think it sends a powerful message that sustainability is no longer a niche issue.
hmm
It's becoming a fundamental consideration for businesses and investors alike. And not just in the EU, these regulations are likely to have a ripple effect globally.
Right.
We've already seen other jurisdictions looking to the EU for guidance as they develop their own ESG regulatory frameworks.
The EU is often a trendsetter in this space, and their actions can influence the global conversation around sustainability.
It's almost like they're setting a new standard for how we think about
Yeah.
and measure corporate responsibility.
I think that's true.
Okay, before we wrap up this section, I want to touch on something we haven't explicitly addressed yet. Why is the EU so focused on sustainability in the first place? What's driving this push for a more sustainable financial system?
Well, I think it comes down to a growing recognition that the way we've been doing business, our consumption patterns, our reliance on fossil fuels, or treatment of workers, is simply unsustainable in the long run.
We're facing some serious global challenges: climate change, social inequality, resource depletion,
Mm.
and the EU is acknowledging that the financial system has a crucial role to play in addressing these challenges.
By directing capital towards sustainable businesses and activities,
Right.
we can help create a more equitable and resilient future. And that's the ultimate goal of these ESG regulations,
Okay.
to leverage the power of finance to drive positive change.
It's a bold vision,
Yeah.
and one that has the potential to transform not just the financial sector, but the way we think about business and our role in society.
Indeed. It's about creating a world where financial success and sustainability go hand in hand.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore this vision in more detail and consider what it means for the future of sustainable business.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the EU's definition of an ESG rating to the nitty-gritty of authorization and transparency requirements. Now, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the potential ripple effects of this regulation. How do you see it shaping the future of sustainable business? Well, what excites me is the potential for this regulation to shift the conversation from simply measuring ESG performance to actually driving real-world impact.
Okay.
Imagine a world where ESG ratings are no longer just box-checking exercises,
Right.
but powerful tools for incentivizing companies to make genuine progress.
Okay.
Yeah,
So it's like giving companies a roadmap or maybe even a report card that clearly shows where they stand on sustainability and what they need to do to improve.
exactly.
And with the EU setting a strong example, I can see this regulatory approach influencing corporate behavior far beyond their borders.
Absolutely. With clearer and more consistent ESG ratings,
Mhm.
companies will have a much better understanding of how investors perceive their sustainability performance, and that can create powerful incentives for change, especially as more investors prioritize ESG factors in their decision-making.
It makes sense. If a company wants access to capital,
Yeah,
they'll need to demonstrate a strong commitment to sustainability. It's like the market itself is starting to reward companies that are doing the right thing
yeah,
and penalize those that are lagging behind.
precisely. And it's not just about financial rewards and penalties. Think about consumers. With greater transparency around ESG ratings,
Right.
they'll also have more information at their fingertips
Mhm.
when making purchasing decisions.
So it's not just investors who can drive change.
Right.
It's consumers, too. They can choose to support companies that align with their values and hold those that don't accountable.
Exactly.
Imagine a world where companies are competing for customers not just on price and quality, but on their sustainability track record as well.
That's the kind of systemic shift we need to see, and
Yeah.
this regulation has the potential to accelerate that shift by empowering both investors and consumers to make more informed choices.
It's a powerful vision, but let's be realistic.
Yeah.
There will likely be pushback, right? Some companies might resist being held to higher standards, especially if it requires them to make significant changes to their operations.
There will undoubtedly be challenges
Right.
and resistance along the way. Change is never easy, and some companies might see this regulation as a burden rather than an opportunity.
Yeah.
But I think the momentum is on the side of sustainability. We're seeing a growing wave of investors, consumers, and even employees demanding that companies take sustainability seriously.
And this regulation gives those stakeholders the tools they need
Yeah,
to hold companies accountable.
exactly. It provides a framework for transparency, comparability, and accountability, making it much harder for companies to greenwash
Right.
or make empty promises.
So what does all of this mean for you, our listener? What role do you have to play in this evolving landscape of sustainable business?
Well, whether you're an investor, a consumer, or simply a concerned citizen, your choices matter. Do your research. Ask questions. Support companies that are genuinely committed to sustainability and hold those that aren't accountable.
It's about using your voice and your wallet to drive positive change.
And remember, this regulation is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The transition to a more sustainable future will require a collective effort with individuals, businesses, and governments all playing their part.
Well said. And on that inspiring note,
Yeah.
we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the EU's new regulation on ESG ratings. I hope this journey through the legal complexities has left you feeling informed, engaged, and maybe even a little empowered.
Remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation as the energy landscape continues to evolve. It's important to stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking the tough questions.
Because that's how we create real change. And that's how we build a better future for all. Until next time, keep diving deep.